I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from the front lines, analyse why Ukraine's bid for EU membership may be more difficult than it first appears, and we ask how Germany's intelligence agency became a liability for Europe.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 6th of February, day 348, and with me to discuss the most recent events in Ukraine and around the world, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nichols, our Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, and our Europe Editor, James Crisp. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, and hello everybody. It's been a busy weekend. Let's start in Bakhmut. So in the Donbass here, still in the central Donbass area, the town of Bakhmut. Today's British Defence Intelligence report saying Bakhmut is, quote, increasingly isolated, unquote. That's after, so Russia's been making a number of small advances recently, in the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, extremely costly and very small, hundreds of meters for each push. But they are pushing towards Bakhmut. So there's two main roads, the M03, which heads northwest out of Bakhmut towards Sloviansk, and the H32, which heads southwest out of the town. They are the two main roads into the city for Ukrainian resupply, logistic resupply. They are now thought to both be under direct fire from Russia. So there's indirect fire and direct fire. Indirect fire is like artillery, when the weapon system firing the round can't see the target. It's working on location that's been provided by other means. Now, these days, indirect fire can be incredibly precise and accurate, and some missiles can be programmed in the air once they've been launched. But generally speaking, direct fire is much more accurate because you, the firer, can physically see the thing you're firing at. Now, that might be with your rifle, it could be with some heavier weapon systems, tanks, so on and so forth. I mean, it can, in extremis, be with artillery as well. You just lower the barrel and fire in a straight line, basically. But direct fire is generally taken to be those weapons that are supposed to be used in that means. But what they're saying here is if those logistic roads, if those roads are the main resupply corridors, if they are threatened, likely threatened, the word is they use likely, but likely threatened by direct fire, then that is a much bigger threat to those routes, rather than just being covered by artillery, if you can imagine it. So if you're trying to dash down those roads with a resupply convoy with fuel, water, ammunition, if you've got artillery bursting around you, that's one thing, indirect fire. But if you've got direct fire weapons laid onto you and trying to hit you directly, then they've got a much greater chance of success. So that is a very, very serious situation there. Now, earlier in the week, so the Wagner paramilitary group, the mercenary group, is still active. We think they took another route which goes due north, straight out of Bakhmut, towards the town of Siversk, which is about 30 k's away. So they are moving forward and slowly, if not encircling Bakhmut, if not moving through the city of Bakhmut itself, then they are sort of strangling it by trying to encircle it and cut off the resupply. Now, UK Defence Intelligence, British Defence Intelligence today says that, quote, while multiple alternative cross-country supply routes remain available to Ukrainian forces, Bakhmut is increasingly isolated, as I say. President Zelensky has referred to it as Fortress Bakhmut. He said it will never be surrendered, and said that more Ukrainian troops are being committed into that area. I'll talk in a little while after the quick updates about what we think is happening at this stage of the war and in this geographic region. But just one more update before I take a little pause is there's confusion today over the position of Ukrainian Defence Minister Alexei Reznikov. There was a Kyiv official yesterday said that he was going to be moved out of the Defence Ministry to become Minister of Strategic Industries, and that he would be replaced by the Chief of Ukrainian Military Intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov. who's well considered to be a very capable guy. He's done good stuff over at the intelligence department. But yeah, quite what's happened to Mr. Reznikov, not sure, because that same Kyiv official said today that no personnel changes are going to be announced at the defense ministry this week. The context here, of course, is President Zelensky has been he's been on a big anti-corruption purge of his government and senior officers. He's trying to sort of clean it all out, partly because it's the right thing to do, partly because that's the election platform he stood on all those months ago before the war started, in this phase of the war anyway. So he's always been keen to try and root out corruption. This is the next wave in this, but it also obviously comes amid, if not concern, then certainly questions being asked, particularly from the Republican side of US politics, about the talk of we can't send a blank check to Ukraine and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't think there is a blank check. I think there are there are oversights. We can have a discussion about whether they're sufficient or not. But this whole idea that President Zelensky has to show that he's a responsible steward for these billions of dollars that are being spent and gifted on and to his country. So, yeah, this purge is within that context. Now, Mr. Reznikov, the defense minister, we think still, he's not been publicly implicated in any scandals, but one of his deputies and several other officials in the defense ministry have. There's a defense contract that's been cited that for supply of food to the armed forces of Ukraine was signed sort of twice or three times the value that it should have been. So, there seems to be something going on there, and quite where Mr. Reznikov is, we do not know. He said yesterday that he had not been informed of any move. So there seems to be some sort of bit of topsy-turvy stuff there. I mean, if Mr. Reznikov has been moved to Minister of Strategic Industries, I mean that's not an absolute purge. It's not suggesting that he was doing anything wrong. I don't think. I think he's carrying the can for those people in his ministry that have been found wanting. That would be my interpretation if this is what's happening. But like I say, it is a very fluid environment, and so we're not quite sure. There's a lot of other little bits and pieces, and by little I don't mean to diminish their significance, because they are very serious. But there's lots of other stuff over the weekend, and then I'd like to talk, if I could, about what we think is happening in the Donbass right now. But I will just take a little pause there.
Thanks very much, Dom. Francis, can I go to you fairly briefly for some of the major diplomatic updates, and then we'll bring in James.
Well, thank you, David, and welcome back to our listeners around the world. I want to start with the big story for us at The Telegraph since our last episode, which is that we are able to name the alleged Russian spy at the centre of what is now the biggest European intelligence scandal in decades. This is, of course, the double agent in Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND. We can reveal that his name is Carsten Linker. He's a 52-year-old father of two and is a volunteer football coach. Now, he's also understood to have been a rising star of the BND, where he oversaw units tasked with spying on foreign communications and internal security. He is suspected of passing on top secret intelligence to Moscow, some of which is believed to have involved and been related to Ukraine. He was, of course, arrested for treason last December. And before his arrest, he was thought to be one of the top rising officials in the BND and was already privy to highly sensitive intelligence that was being shared amongst Western spies. There was also a courier involved, which we've talked about in the past. We're not able to name him, but he's understood to be a charismatic businessman already living a jet-set lifestyle at the age of 31. He was born in Russia before moving to Germany as a child, and then joined the German armed forces before starting a business career. It's believed that the two were meeting at some kind of barbecue, and that this was where they were meeting up in order to exchange intelligence, and that would then be leaked via this courier straight to Moscow, who had already perhaps recruited him earlier. That's one of the theories, and that he was attending this barbecue in order to establish contact with Mr. Linker. So a really, really significant development, this, and one that has caused big comment over the course of the weekend. We broke it on Friday night. So, and I'm well aware that James, listening to this, will have a lot of thoughts because he was writing on it over the weekend.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for that, Francis. Well, let's go straight to our Europe editor, James Crisp. James, you wrote a fascinating sort of analysis of this for The Telegraph called How Germany's Intelligence Agency Became a Liability for Europe. So would you just take some of the news that Francis has relayed and put everything he said in context for us?
It really is sort of a fascinating story. Basically, we have to go back into the early 1990s, just after the reunification of Germany. And then there was kind of a decision really to hollow out the German intelligence services. You know, there were massive staff cuts. That only picked up pace after the Cold War. One of the men who's blamed for basically not doing anything to remedy this and actually overseeing some of these cuts is none other than Gerhard Schroeder, a friend of the podcast, I'd imagine, the former German chancellor who has basically become a sort of a Putin propagandist in chief, taking the sort of the Gazprom ruble to pay for his numerous divorces. So many divorces, in fact, he's known as the Lord of the Rings in Germany, which always makes me chuckle. Anyway, Mr. Schroeder didn't do anything to sort out this issue. I mean, to put it into context, they didn't even have a counter-espionage unit until 2017. It had been closed down. So really, you had a situation where Germany was almost a sort of a playground for foreign intelligence, Russian foreign. Not only, of course, I mean, the Americans turned out to be secretly bugging Angela Merkel's phone, if you remember. The first that the BND, the German intelligence service, found out about it was after the Snowden leaks. So we really got an institution here which hasn't really been given the tools to do its job. It's sort of further hampered by a cultural apathy towards espionage in Germany. Totally understandable, of course, but, you know, after the experience of the Gestapo and especially the Stasi in East Germany, there really is a different focus and emphasis on the importance of privacy and a deep sort of distrust of state agencies snooping, which I think has also sort of contributed to this lack of investment, basically, this lack of funding. But, you know, these kind of double agents are not something new in the senior ranks of the BND. In fact, back in the 1950s, it turned out the very first boss of the BND was a double agent for the KGB. So there's a sort of a long and inglorious history here, which contrasts very poorly with, I don't know, Sweden, the Nordic nations, where despite the end of the Cold War, they sort of kept up a first-class spy service. Now, as you'd imagine, you know, this scandal has led to a lot of calls in Germany from political parties saying, you know, time to sort this out, not fit for purpose, needs an overhaul, a sort of a revolution, really, in the same way as kind of has been promised for the sort of chronically under-equipped German army. But, you know, you can make those promises, but as kind of is the story, really, of Germany and Ukraine, those decisions are being made a little bit too late. I mean, that might not be entirely fair, but it's certainly the impression that's being given.
Well, thank you very much for that, James. That was fascinating. Can we just stay on the EU, zoom out a little bit more? The EU is planning for Volodymyr Zelensky, that's Ukrainian president, to attend a summit of its leaders this week. This came from the Financial Times today. But you've written, again, a very interesting analysis for the Telegraph on just how tricky and difficult it will be for Ukraine to join the EU. Could you talk us through, I mean, this is a huge subject, so please take your time, but could you talk us through exactly why? I mean, this feels hugely important because, of course, this is something diplomatically the Ukrainian side want dearly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing to say straight off the bat is that the EU does want Ukraine to join the EU. Just not now, and certainly not in the 2 years that the Ukrainians are suggesting might be possible. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some are political, some are quite tedious and legalistic, and some are both, to be honest. I think the most important thing for everyone to understand, and I say this as a sort of a guy who covered the Brexit negotiations in depth from Brussels, so take my word on this, it is even harder to join the EU than it is to leave. In fact, it is much harder to join. You know, you're talking about a long, painful, sometimes extremely frustrating process of gradually absorbing EU law, taking it onto, this covers everything from human rights legislation to central banking to, pig health. I mean, pretty much anything you can imagine, there will be a regulation for it. And you need to sort of get this onto your national books so that when you do join, you're ready, you're part of the single market, and, you're not distorting the single market. Now, even when you were talking about countries like, Finland, Sweden, I think, they joined in 1995. These are, rich Western European nations, which I don't think anyone would, they more or less, but there's no sort of big problem with them joining the EU. Even then, I mean, it took 3 to 5 years. So you take a look at some of the Central and Eastern European countries that joined in what's called the Big Bang, the 10 countries in 2003. And most of them, we were talking 10 years of negotiations, 10 years of tests, 10 years of, jumping through all of these hoops before it then gets put to a final vote. And even then, all sorts of stuff can go wrong. It can be vetoed you have to be unanimously supported by every member state. I mean, at the moment, Albania has been waiting to join for coming up on, I think, 10 years. And I think it first said it wanted to join 17 years ago. And the only reason it isn't joining at the moment is because Bulgaria is having a sort of a bizarre, arcane argument about the historical origins of its language with North Macedonia. And because they want Bulgaria, North Macedonia and Albania to join at the same time, everything's ground to a halt. That sort of thing sounds weird, but it's not that unusual. And these are countries which aren't in the middle of a war, aren't in the middle of a fight for their very survival. Anyone who knows followed anything to do with Brexit will know how important borders are. You need to know where the single market ends so that you can impose the checks to make sure that whatever comes in adheres to EU standards, right? EU regulation. No one knows where the borders in Ukraine are going to be. I mean, they're moving all the time. So that is a very basic problem. The next problem is Ukraine is not a small country. It is a big country, right? When it joins, it will also be the poorest country in the EU by quite a distance. That was the case even before the war. So you've also got to factor in the money for reconstruction, EU funding. There's something called cohesion funds. This is basically money from the EU budget, which is designed to try and raise living standards across the bloc to roughly the same level, or to at least help get towards that kind of level. You'll see them still in the UK. When you walk around, occasionally you'll see a little EU flag left over from when we're members in certain areas where they weren't getting enough funding. So it's not just in poorer countries. It's in the Western countries as well. But this for Ukraine will be huge, right? It'll be a huge amount. Ukraine is basically 55%, or it was, farmland, right? It's one of the world's breadbaskets. One of the biggest chunks of the EU budget is the Common Agricultural Policy. It's sort of this huge, massively sort of totemic and symbolically important network of subsidies, which are basically, I'm simplifying, but are basically dished out on how many acres you have. Well, Ukrainian farmers have a lot of acres. So that is a massive chunk of, something which has been part of the EU since the very beginning and is, French farmers are going to be worried about that. Spanish farmers, all of Europe's farmers, basically. So that is going to have to be reformed. They're going to have to come up with some way of making sure that you don't have a sudden huge drain on the budget, or you're going to have to increase the budget, or you're going to have to introduce kind of a phase-in on CAP funding. All of this stuff requires negotiation on some of the most difficult areas to reach agreement in EU policymaking. Historically, I think the last time they tried to reform, and this is pretty basic reforms, the last time they tried to reform the agricultural subsidies, it took 3 years. So that's a problem. Then you've got all this money coming from the budget going towards Ukraine. Now that is going to change things for some member states, and those member states will have a veto on Ukraine joining. So the Czech Republic and Portugal are currently net recipients of EU funding. That means they pay their membership fees, but they get more money back. If Ukraine joins, or when Ukraine joins, Portugal and the Czech Republic will become net contributors to the budget, which means they pay in more to the EU than they get back out. I mean, that is a shift, that is a big change. And some countries, will be proud to be net contributors. Ireland was very pleased to be a net contributor. They saw that as a good and right thing to be. But, it's another concern, another potential headache. Then there's the shift to the balance of power. Now, this is a real sort of concern for countries like Germany. The EU's voting system is based on population. Ukraine's a big country. It's a populous country. So it's so populous that if it was to team up with something like Poland, a country like Poland, it might be able to swing some of the decisions its way. So you've got a situation here where the balance of power could shift if, people were canny in Kiev and Warsaw, could start to shift away from the traditional axis or engine of France and Germany towards the Central and Eastern European powers. That'd be a massive change. Now, again, there's discussion about whether there should be treaty change. Germany wants treaty change to sort of basically make it less possible for individual countries to veto various foreign policy decisions and to try and kind of prevent this shift of balance of power. But treaty change is massively controversial. I mean, years and years and years of talking. Even men, you fast track Ukraine, you've got 6 Western Balkan countries who've been kicking their heels waiting to join, especially Albania. Montenegro, Kosovo and Serbia, okay, they're a bit further off. But these countries, they will quite rightly say, what about us? We've done everything. We've followed the rules. How come Ukraine gets to jump the queue? So, and then obviously Georgia and Moldova, after Ukraine applied to join, they also applied to join. So, they've got to sort of balance that. I mean, there is always the possibility that Hungary could just veto the application because they've had this long-running disagreement with Ukraine over their language rules, which they think discriminates against the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. So there's a huge amount of obstacles, difficult, complicated obstacles. And, the EU isn't the type of organization, just to take it back to Brexit, which rips up its rule book without very, very, very good reason. And right now, this would require it to rip up a lot of its rule book. And you could there's an anxiety among EU capitals not to sort of get Ukraine's hopes up too high, but they'll be able to basically be sort of welcomed in. I mean, look, there's no way Ukraine can join while the war continues. There's just no, I can't see that happening. But anyway, so a lot of obstacles, but biggest obstacle remains Vladimir Putin and his illegal war.
Well, thank you so much for that, James. I think you really talked us through some of the big issues there. That was really helpful. Can I just ask quickly, I mean, you talked about how difficult it was even for sort of rich nations like Sweden and Finland to join, and even for them it took years. And you said, and they're not even at war, they're at peace. Is there any sense that you get from EU capitals or diplomats that they do regard Ukraine as a special case? And if that's so, does that mean these accession rules could be changed at all? I mean, I think you'll say no, not really. But I'm just curious to see if you've picked up on any sense that they may think of Ukraine differently because of the fact it's at war.
Well, they do think of Ukraine differently. I mean, they do think of Ukraine differently. If you go back to 2014, before 2014, the Maidan protests, that was a clear sort of signal that Ukraine was kind of turning to the West and to Europe and to the EU, right? I mean, it was quite an unusual thing at the time to see people marching in the streets with EU flags. It was quite an impressive moment. And I think that there is a sort of a belief that kind of, for want of a better way of describing it, has to be rewarded. Look, the Commission gave its opinion on whether or not Ukraine could be a candidate country, which is one of the steps to joining. It gave that in record time. Normally that takes a long time. And they got it fast, right? As a sort of a signal, to show that there is this path towards eventual membership. But, the worst thing which can happen is the Ukrainians end up feeling betrayed. And that is the feeling that I've got from talking to but that is, they don't want this fake expectation. And, look, we were talking earlier about the defense minister having to be moved on for corruption reasons. The timing of all of those, that shuffle was quite interesting, because corruption is a major issue, right, in Ukraine, and the EU demands major reforms, especially in the fight against corruption, which is something Bulgaria still has to report on, and Romania still has to report on. Both of them joined the EU, but they joined the EU with a special mechanism where they have to report on corruption. So the timing of Zelensky sort of sacking or shuffling around these ministers just before the EU presidents were in Kyiv last week, I think was designed to send a very clear message that despite the fact we're at war, we're still going through all of the reforms insofar as we can. We are doing our homework. But I think it's. One of the problems is that every time you predict one of these things with the EU, and at the last sort of minute, when it looks like there's absolutely no way out or no sort of solution to a problem, there's a late night summit and they come up with some sort of solution. I don't think we'll get to it at that stage, but I think basically the war has to end, and then once the war ends, it'll be a long journey towards EU membership. Other sort of carrots that they can offer. One thing that is worth sort of mentioning is that there was an association agreement between EU and Ukraine, which was signed before the war, and that means that Ukraine already has 70% of the EU's single market rules. But that association agreement, which came with visa-free travel and stuff like that, was originally designed as an alternative to EU membership. So I think there'll be ways of making Ukraine feel welcome in Europe without them actually legally joining, which is perhaps why Zelensky's speaking at the summit this week.
Thank you very much, James. Do you have time just to take a quick question from Dom, or not? No worries if not.
Yes, sure, I do. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. James, lovely to hear you again. And my question is, are you detecting anybody around Brussels, around the EU more broadly, who are trying to use the war to further any EU defence aspirations, this idea of either a Euro army or a bolstered sort of foreign service or what have you? Anybody trying to leverage off the war?
I don't think that's something which is sort of particularly new. It certainly happened at the time, and before then it was being so look, EU army, it's been talked about for a long time. I can't see it sort of happening in our lifetime, basically. But what I can see is, I think the problem is that basically you saw with the leaving Afghanistan, the retreat from Afghanistan, that was immediately seized upon as an argument for a greater pooling of EU defence funding and research funding. Likewise, the war in Ukraine has also been used by people within the EU, by Emmanuel Macron, as an argument for greater, what they call strategic autonomy. The idea that you shouldn't be so reliant on the US for your defense, that you bolster your defense funding, and that if preferably you buy European to do that. One of the fears, if you like, is in Europe is that what happens if Donald Trump wins the next US election? You remember how he was, not exactly a friend of NATO. And that, the idea that would happen when you have Russia and China in this very sort of belligerent mode is really concentrating minds in Europe. And I don't, and this isn't, to build a European army, but this is about finding ways to make it easier for EU countries to increase their defense spending. One of the ideas that's been kicked about is based on the coronavirus response. In order to sort of get this huge war chest to reboot the EU's economy, for the first time, member states borrowed huge amounts of money against the EU budget. Now, the EU budget is huge, right? It is massive. It's hundreds of billions. I forget how much it is off the top of my head, but it is Google it and you will be, astonished by how large it is. And of course, it has a AAA credit rating. So that means that a country, a poorer country, can borrow against that, get the money cheaper because it's against the budget, and keep the debt off its own national budget sheet. So that's sort of being explored, whether they could do something similar in defence and defence spending. Yeah, so I think, whenever there's a crisis, they always say in Brussels, a crisis is an opportunity for Europe, basically. Their answer to any crisis is more Europe. And when you're the EU, you see Russia on one side, China on the other, and the US, there's basically, since it was set up in the 50s, the idea was as a way of kind of preventing Europe from being squashed by the superpowers, banding together for protection, basically.
Thank you, James and Dom. Francis Sternley, you've been listening to all of that. What would you like to add?
Thanks. Well, I echo James's sentiments on this. I don't believe that the bureaucracy of the European Union will want to process fast-track Ukraine to becoming a member in the short term for all of the reasons that James has cited. There is, of course, within the EU a strain of thinking that its strongest asset, as it were, is that it takes time to do things. It delays and it thinks things through, it rationalizes things, and as a consequence, it believes that it reaches the right conclusion, although, of course, it can take many, many years to get there. That is what some people believe is its greatest strength. But for others, they would argue that perhaps that's also its greatest weakness, that in times of crisis, as we've seen in recent months, they are slow to react, slow to respond quite often. And one has to ask whether if the European Union had, and the European Commission specifically, had been in charge of Europe's defence protocols, as many believe it should be, we were talking about the EU army there, that whether Ukraine would still be in the strong position that it is, that it was actually countries being able to act independently. Of course, the Czech Republic offering tanks, Britain offering considerable military support that enabled Kyiv to hold on in those valuable opening days of the war that would not have been possible if all of the defence infrastructure and architecture of Europe was controlled from the centre. So we're getting here into conversations at the very heart of what the EU is and what it should be. And I do fear, as James says, that there is going to be considerable tension within Ukraine as this goes on about exactly what the EU has promised it and whether it will be able to deliver it in a time frame that is actually helpful for Ukraine. And will there be a point where it will actually be an impediment that people will be able to point and say, well, hang on, I thought it was meant to be joining the EU. They're delaying, they're not doing it, it's going to take years. And that will play actually into the Russian narratives that the West has betrayed them, etc. I'm not saying that is going to happen. I'm just saying it's a possibility. So I do share some of those anxieties that James was just talking about.
Thank you very much for that, Francis. Dom, I know you had quite a few updates left for us. Do you want to take us through them?
Yeah, thanks. So whizzing through, and like I say, I don't mean to diminish the impact or the import of any one of them, but there's quite a few bits over the weekend, so just going to rattle through them. Canadian Leopard 2 tanks have arrived in Poland. No date yet for training or when they will be moved further on. I don't think they'll be moved piecemeal. I think Ukraine are going to wait until they have trained not just on tanks but infantry and infantry fighting vehicles, armor and other things, to have an armored brigade at least, if not more, division perhaps, before we start seeing them go into Ukraine. Also over the weekend, Ukrainian troops started arriving in the UK to train on the AS-90. 155mm self-propelled howitzers, quite old AS-90 artillery system of the 90s, but still capable. And Britain's gifted, I think, 3 batteries worth of AS-90. And images were also released by British MOD of Ukrainian personnel training on Challenger 2 tanks down at the Bovington driver training area down there. Separately, the bodies of the 2 Britons that were killed trying to help people get out of Ukraine have been recovered in a prisoner swap. So this is according to Kyiv officials on Saturday. There was a prisoner swap with Russia, during which there was also an exchange of, certainly of these 2 bodies. So Chris Parry, who was 28, and his colleague Andrew Bagshaw, 47, who was actually dual UK and New Zealand, had dual citizenship there. They were working in Solidar, which is north of Bakhmut, trying to evacuate an elderly woman when their car was hit by an artillery shell. So they were killed some time ago. There was a question mark about exactly what had happened to them when the Wagner group said that they'd discovered documents and what have you, but it was then later confirmed that they had died, but their bodies have been returned. Separately, a US medic, Pete Reed, has been reportedly killed near Bakhmut. His vehicle also hit by a missile. No further details known on that yet. And just the final update, Ukraine has said it stands ready to assist Turkey after this morning's double earthquake. Two very, very powerful earthquakes, I think 7.7 and 7.8 on the Richter scale, hit Turkey this morning. Hundreds suspected dead. And Dmytro Kuleba, who's Ukraine's foreign minister, has said, quote, Ukraine stands ready to send a large group of rescue workers to Turkey to assist the crisis response. We're working closely with the Turkish side to coordinate their deployment, unquote. I think that is genuine, as it is. There will be others trying to say that it's just politics and they're trying to keep Turkey on side. I don't think that's the case here, because other nations, Britain included, have made lots of very public pledges today over those earthquakes this morning. And I just want to finally, just very quickly, sort of take stock on where we are. There's been a huge debate as to the cost of the fighting at the moment around Bakhmut and in the Donbass, and whether or not it's worth it for either side. Russia is losing thousands of people for very, very small territorial gains, and equally, although we're not able to put a figure on it, haven't really got any accurate figures there, but we think Ukraine is losing a lot of people in the defence of some territory that is not massively important to the war. So what's happening here? And for help with this, I advise anybody to have a look at Phillips O'Brien, who's the Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. Very, very good chap to follow on this, and he's been tweeting widely, and he was suggesting that actually what's happening in the Donbass at the moment is we're seeing these. He hasn't used the phrase human waves, but others have these sort of human wave tactics of Russian troops just charging Ukrainian positions. He's suggesting this sudden glut of personnel is probably those that were mobilised back in September. They're now really coming online, although they've not had a huge amount of training. You don't need a huge amount if all you're doing is being used to sort of, as he thinks, to test the area, test the defensives, because any experienced troops are either dead. Russian troops, this is dead, exhausted, or back in Russia training the mobilised personnel. So, there's not many left in the fight, and hence there's a suggestion that actually Russia is probing Ukraine's lines with conscripts and convicts in the case of the Wagner Group, and then where they find a breakthrough or are able to exploit any kind of success, they use the few experienced troops they have to push them forward to try and get through that line there. We think Wagner have recruited about 50,000 conscripts, or certainly that's the size of the Wagner Group we think at the moment in these kind of probing attacks. There's no serious effort at a proper reconnaissance. They're not working together when they're not using their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets cleverly. They're just sort of pushing against Ukraine's positions and seeing which bits are weaker. And at the same time, Russia is not building its forces. They're not building up the combined arms that they need, the tanks working with the infantry and the artillery and the air defence and all the rest of it. They're not doing that. They seem to be, as soon as they get a force ready, they're just pushing it forward, just very poorly trained, poorly equipped, poorly led men rushing towards the Ukrainians' positions. And it's a bit like the classic thing you say with your kids. Do you want one sweet today or two tomorrow, to try and get them to think about the future and think about hold down their initial impulse and I'll what's the word, delayed gratification, but the kids always go for one sweet today. Well, that seems to be what Russia's doing. They're going for the one sweet today concept, as opposed to just sort of stopping, defending, holding their line and building up these combined arms that they need. They're just rushing forward when they get any grouping of people ready. So what does all that mean? And this is, again, Phillips O'Brien's suggestion. He's saying that actually it's gritty and it's bloody and it's hugely costly for both sides, but Ukraine needs to try and hold on, maybe cede territory if required in certain areas, because they are buying themselves time for their combined arms, the tanks that I've just talked about, the artillery that they're being trained on, all the other bits and pieces that are now being gifted and flowing into the area, if not into the actual country itself. But Ukraine's holding on for a time when it can build an armoured brigade, at least, if not a division, a brigade of about 2,000 people, a division probably 2 or 3 brigades worth, so 5, 6, 7, 8,000, something like that. So it's not a race against time. It's who can hold on the longest, really. Russia, these tactics, as costly as they will probably say, well, they're working. They are slowly making ground, as we said right at the start of today's episode. They are slowly encircling Bakhmut. They are now within range of the resupply routes for that city. So although it's coming at extreme cost, Russia will probably say that that's good enough for them. And Ukraine, I think, might well say, well, it's good enough for them as well. They are holding and they are ceding ground where they have to and where they wish to, because they are trying to buy themselves time to build up this force that we may yet see later in the spring towards the summer. So a horrendous grinding conflict, but it seemingly suits both sides to do that, and that's why it's possibly not going anywhere, and we're not seeing any other advances across the front. Russia, I think, seem to be happy with the progress they are making in the centre, so they're not looking to have another go at Kharkiv or Kherson or anywhere like that. They're just pushing in the centre at great cost, but it's happy, it works for them, and I think Ukraine would probably say the same.
Thank you very much for your analysis, Dom. Francis, I know you've got a couple more diplomatic updates for us. Can we go to you next? And then I think, unfortunately, we'll have to start wrapping up and just get both of your final thoughts. So, Francis Sternley.
Well, thanks, David. I spoke last week, of course, about the military donations from the US, most significantly these ground-launched small-diameter bombs, which will allow Ukraine's military to hit targets at twice the distance of the HIMARS rockets, which have proved so decisive so far. Unsurprisingly, there has been a reaction from within Russia to this. Former Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has said that all of Ukraine will burn after the West pledged to supply Kyiv with more sophisticated weapons. Now, it should be said he's not necessarily speaking for the Kremlin, but I do think that he speaks in a manner that the Kremlin will approve of. And the reason we know that, of course, he conducted this interview with a Kremlin-aligned RBC news outlet. He said that as a consequence of these more sophisticated weapons going there, that it would force Moscow to retaliate. And, you know, we should never be surprised by these kind of incendiary remarks from Moscow, but neither should we just ignore them. They are extraordinary and noteworthy, and I think that it's right to always draw attention to them when they are made. Another country threatened with being burned as a consequence of the actions of another, just extraordinary. But it hasn't deterred the West. There's been conversations between President Zelensky and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak over the weekend about the further expansion of Ukraine's military capabilities. Norway's Prime Minister on Monday proposed that his country will provide aid to Ukraine of a further 75 billion Norwegian crowns, which comes to about $7.3 billion in total over a 5-year period. And Germany, too, have also said that the Leopard 2 battalions that they committed to sending will be on their way soon, after the sufficient commitments have been reached from other European countries to send their promised contingent of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. So we've just heard that from a German spokesman literally in the last hour or so. Just a couple of other stories that I wanted to draw attention to in the political diplomatic space. The first is quite an extraordinary one, which has already been vehemently denied by the White House today. And this follows a report that Newsweek have covered, but also it was in a Swiss-German newspaper originally, that the head of the CIA, William Burns, went to Moscow back in January and offered Putin a fifth of Ukraine's territory to end the war as part of a peace plan drawn up on behalf of President Biden. Quite an extraordinary story, this. We don't have lots more details than that, but this has been very, very strongly denied this morning. The White House have said it's completely false, and indeed there's been numerous evidence that's been cited from various sources saying that this is simply untrue. Some of them are saying that the timelines don't align and everything. So, anyway, I touch on it just because it is a cause of conversation this morning, and unsurprisingly, given the nature of it. The other big story that's causing quite considerable comment this morning is remarks from the former Israeli Prime Minister, who served briefly as a mediator at the start of the war, who has said that he drew a promise from Putin not to kill Zelensky. This is, again, coming from an interview that he has made in a 5-hour interview that touched on numerous subjects that was published over the weekend. And he describes a conversation that he had with Putin where he asked him outright whether he was planning on killing Zelensky. And Putin said that he would not do so. I won't kill Zelensky, supposedly Putin said. And then this gentleman replied, I have to understand that you'll give me your word that you won't kill Zelensky. And then Putin reiterated, I'm not going to kill Zelensky. He then goes on and says how he came out of the meeting and said that, and told Zelensky himself that he wasn't planning, that Putin was not planning on killing him. Zelensky apparently asked, are you sure? And the Israeli Prime Minister said, I'm 100% sure he won't kill you. Now, of course, we already know that there were plans for the Russian special forces to kill or capture Zelensky, so I don't think we should see these pledges made by Putin as being necessarily accurate. But again, quite extraordinary, I would argue, that the nature of these conversations were even taking place. You know, the fact that it would be possible for a prime minister to ask a president of another country to whether they're planning to assassinate a democratically elected leader. I mean, in a sense, the medium is the message, right? It's just an extraordinary thing for it even to be a possibility that it's happening in the 21st century, I would argue. So I just wanted to touch on that, and you can understand why there will be considerable comments on that this morning, because it is quite an extraordinary claim, even if it doesn't actually change any of the facts, although perhaps it does speak, given what we do know, the fact that Putin is an unreliable narrator, as we could say.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Francis. Francis, can I stay with you? Because I know Dom's got a slightly different final thought for us all. So, Francis, what will you be looking at over the next few days? What springs to mind from your observation of the last few days?
Thank you, David. I just wanted to respond to a continuing line I hear from realists with regard to how this war is going to end on this question of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia and what that means for the future. So I keep hearing this argument that it is a historical fact, a historical reality, that taking the long view, Ukraine is and will consequently remain a part of the wider Russian orbit, however this war ends. So they argue that the idea of a total severance is impossible. This war will end with some kind of relationship, some kind of truce. This is self-evident. As I say, they say it's just a fact, given the close relationship over the past between these two countries. But I just wanted to question this as being an absolute certainty if one is looking at history. To just use one example, one of course that will be very familiar to listeners on this podcast across the pond, people said exactly the same thing about the relationship between America and Britain during the American Revolutionary War. They said that the two countries were too closely aligned, that whatever the peace would end with, it would end with some kind of halfway house where both Britain and America were still closely aligned, perhaps in some way that had some political overlap in some way. But if we look, of course, at what really happened, the Patriots, the American revolutionaries, fought and won a war against Britain, a mightier foe, and achieved what many said was absolutely impossible, that being total political independence. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, I believe it was a triumph for the Americans. It did take, however, 8 years for the larger forces of Britain and its resources, of course, to be defeated, and continued and sustained support from France, who gave them weapons and gunpowder, amongst other things. I just mention this rather, I know this may seem a bit of an odd example to use given that it was in the 18th century, but it does, I think, fundamentally underline that proximity, cultural overlap shouldn't be a measure for the strength of kinship once the wrongs have been committed. The wrongs that Russia have inflicted on Ukraine since February last year are more than sufficient to lead for a strong desire for severance, not just amongst the political class, but amongst ordinary people too, including in those areas, as we've reported now, which formerly had stronger pro-Russian sentiments. So I just flag this to say beware this idea that this war is inevitably going to end with some kind of closer or some kind of relationship between Russia and Ukraine that is closer than some people believe at this point in the war. I don't see that as necessarily being something that is historically accurate if one is looking through the long lens of the past. At the end of the day, as they always say with history, nothing is absolute, and nothing is definitely written based on historical precedent.
Thank you very much, Francis. That's probably the most pro-American revolution position we've heard on the Telegraph for a long time, so that'll be interesting. Thank you very much, Francis.
I know, I can't quite believe what I'm saying, David. Comparing Russia with Britain, it's outrageous.
I look forward to our emails on that one. Dom Nichols, what's your final thought?
Yeah, thanks, David. I just wanted to say, so after months of frustration, I've finally made it. I've been told that I'm going to be sanctioned by Russia. I'm on the next list of sanctions, which apparently, I mean, I'm not alone here. We've got other friends and colleagues at the Telegraph, Joe Barnes, for example, a Brussels correspondent, and others. Our editor, Chris Evans, he's been sanctioned, and there are others in the international media landscape. So, I say I was very disappointed that it's taken this long, but here we go, got there in the end. And what it means is, as far as I can tell, that I can no longer take a holiday in Russia. My Russian bank accounts have all been seized. The 4 dachas just outside Moscow, I'm not going to be able to repaint. It's not really going to have that much effect on me, I can assure you. But I take delight not only for the shits and giggles of taking it to Russia, but because this means something, and this proves words hurt, and I think that's worth reflecting on just for a moment. So, the great sage Mr. A. Schwarzenegger of Hollywood, California, said when he was Dutch, said, "If it bleeds, we can kill it." Well, we now know what Russia is scared of, what this Russian regime, this kleptocratic regime, feel hurts them. All I've got is my voice and the words that I put in the paper and online, and it's resulted in me being sanctioned. Correct, tick. That shows them for what they are. And I urge you to take strength from this, because we get inundated, and I do mean that, inundated with fantastic messages here from our lovely listeners, many of whom say they are very angry and they are frustrated, that they feel disempowered and impotent. They are geographically separated. Some people feel they can't help in any way. Help push back against this disgusting display of humanity. And I think what the Kremlin have done here is shown you exactly, if you feel that way, have shown you exactly what you can do to contribute. So if you want to play a role, and you don't have to, of course, we're delighted that you're just listening, but if you want to do something else, if you want to play a role on the international information flank of this war, if I could put it that way, then the Kremlin's shown you what you can do. You use words. You speak to your friends, your family, your colleagues, if you want. You use those words to describe facts, which they hate. So if you want to, you can do this. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can do it. You can use your words to explain facts. You can do it with integrity, and you can do it with a display of your own humanity. But if you want, you can fight. And I will continue to fight.
In December, we spoke to Yuri Tokarski, the Chief Executive Officer of the UHearts Foundation. UHearts is a non-profit which works towards improving living conditions for pets across Eastern Europe. Yuri spoke about his organisation's work with pets in Ukraine, many thousands of whom had either been abandoned or fled with their owners as the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine prompted a humanitarian crisis. Yuri spoke of the challenges of supporting pets and ended by explaining a little about UHearts' Christmas appeal. Well, we kept in touch, and it turns out many listeners ended up donating, so I went back to Yuri to hear what happened over the Christmas period. Yuri, it's really wonderful to see you and hear from you again. Can you just remind our listeners what your charity does, where you operate, and the challenges you face?
Hi, David. It's also great to be your guest again. Thank you very much for having us over. We are at the UHearts Foundation, and we implement the Safe Pets of Ukraine initiative, helping pets and animals who are suffering from the consequences of the war in Ukraine. So we are active in the country since the Russian invasion began in February, and we've been able to help shelters and pet volunteers with pet food, with supporting the sterilization and supporting vaccination effort, and also with medical treatment.
How have you and your team found working this winter? We know it's been tough for Ukrainians across the country for all sorts of different reasons. How have you found helping the animal population?
Well, of course, winter brings very different challenges for shelters and for pet volunteers. We have noticed that a lot of new animals who landed on the streets because of the war are animals who are used to live in homes. These are pets who lost their families, so they are not really used to, they do not know how to find warm places, how to find shelter on the streets. So one challenge is how to save them from the cold temperatures. And another challenge is to support animal shelters who are struggling with lack of electricity and oftentimes with lack of heating. So we focused our efforts on the one hand to provide more food to volunteers who feed animals on the streets, because by offering them more calories, it keeps them warm. And we also purchased electricity generators and mobile heaters and distributed and donated those to several animal shelters to make sure that they keep running their operations also in this wintertime.
Yuri, we spoke for the first time back in December ahead of your Christmas sort of charity push. We're partly doing this because we know that, you've told us that lots of our listeners contacted you and were very kind with their donations. So what I want to do kind of for them really is to just understand from your side what happened. What numbers did you see coming in and where did that go? What did you do with it?
Yes, thank you, David. We were running the Christmas campaign together with one of Ukraine's largest retailers. We put together hampers for cats and dogs as Christmas gifts. And we were very much inspired to see a high degree of interest sparkling specifically after the last time we spoke. So all in all, the Christmas campaign brought over 120 hampers. Those were donated to animals in the shelters, those pets who are being prepared for adoption. So they got a little Christmas gift to cheer up their mood. But we also were very surprised to see a spike in monetary donations too. So we collected over 7,000 euro in monetary donation coming in after our conversation. And this funding was going into procurement of generators, procurement of mobile heaters, and this is also the funds we use to fund our distribution efforts. So we pay for transportation, both of the donations we receive abroad into Ukraine and for transportation within Ukraine. This is the kind of work that the money of the audience has supported, and we hope it will also keep supporting us in the future.
Well, that's really wonderful to hear. I mean, just so I can understand and our listeners can understand, you said 7,000 euros. Is that a particularly high amount to receive? Where does that stand for you in terms of donations? Compared
to our annual or our monthly budget, David, it's I would say it's roughly 10 to 15% of what we need. But we noticed that it was an unusual period of time. So it was very much linked to the Christmas campaign. And that's why I think it's worthwhile to give a special appreciation and special thanks to your listeners who chose to donate to us because they heard our conversation and because they understand the winter challenges that the animals in Ukraine are facing.
Anzelika and Yuri, you mentioned you might be able to tell us a little bit about the story of one of the pets you were able to help. Can you take us through that?
Yes, we have a couple of good examples of animals that we support. I chose to tell a story about our partnership that we have recently concluded with the National Police of Ukraine. They have a canine service, so their service dogs are the ones who are helping with very oftentimes with demining and looking for explosive devices in areas that are already reasonably safe, but still they were part of the active fighting ground, and very often there are explosives who remain undetected. So there is a story of a dog called Bars, who originally is from the Lviv region in the west of the country, but he was dispatched on a working trip to help with demining in the Kyiv area, which was under occupation for couple of months back when the war was raging there. And one family, when they returned to their apartment in Bucha, which was a town that was particularly affected by the war, they had a piano that the kids used to play. And they noticed that some things around the piano were moved. So they were smart enough to call the police, and the police came with the dog and detected that the piano was actually mined. There was a grenade inside that was left by the retreating Russians. So thanks to the dog, then the sappers could come and demine the apartment. So this is the kind of work that these service dogs are doing every day. They are saving lives, and we are proud that because we can donate food and other supplies to the canine service. By doing that, we do also a very small part, of course, but we feel that it's an important work that we are supporting.
Well, that's an astonishing story. Thank you for sharing that. What are your plans looking forward to the rest of the year now? We spoke in December about the challenges that you face in winter, but looking forward to 2023, what do you think are the challenges? What is your organisation going to be focusing on?
Well, David, what we did very recently is we did a survey of the animal shelters and pet volunteers. We researched on over 500 of them across Ukraine to understand better what their needs precisely would be, so that we are prepared for the long-term response. We see on the one hand that the amount of animals in shelters has increased by over 60% since the beginning of the war. So really this massive movement, these millions of people who fled either abroad or within the country, and many of them could not take their pets with them and had to leave them behind. Those animals are coming to shelters. Very often, because they are not meant to be living on the streets, when they come to shelters, they are already sick. Very often, it's unclear whether or not they were vaccinated. So a lot of effort is required in the area of medical treatment, vaccination, and also spay and neuter operations. Spay and neuter is particularly important because usually this work is done at a local level, and these centers are funded by the local governments, which right now have unfortunately limited financial capacity to invest into these. So if we neglect this now, we would face a situation where we would have much larger population of animals to be taken care of. So right now, what we are trying to do more, we are doing this already, but we want to expand more into medical treatment, into vaccinations, and into spay and neuter operations. So we are planning to support vaccination centers, veterinarian clinics, and spay and neuter centers with supplies and with donations where it's possible. So we are looking also to donors who would be donating medications, vaccines, along with the pet food that is always needed. So we will keep the food operation running, but we would add also an operation in medical treatment, in spay and neuter, and in vaccinations.
Yeah, the last question was looking forward to 2023, but now we're coming up to the anniversary of the start of the full-scale invasion in February. Looking back over your work in the past year, is there a moment or an action that you're particularly sort of proud of that you'd want to highlight for our listeners?
Well, we are very much near to a round figure, let's say. In our aid, we would have distributed 1,000 tons of pet food across the whole country, helping over 150,000 animals to be fed. So this is a number that makes us proud in the sense that we are doing a bit to alleviate the suffering of the animals, but also making lives of their pet parents a little bit easier. And one particular project that really stuck in my mind and we are particularly proud of, I would say, during the large-scale evacuation in the beginning of the war, right in March, when people were fleeing in large numbers from the east, taking evacuation trains and other transports, we placed our volunteers in railway stations in all major transportation hubs, and we were distributing animal supplies to those who were traveling with their pets. So we would give some pet food, some water, a bowl, a blanket, some toy for a dog or for a cat to make sure that the journey is just a little bit better. And it was very rewarding to see how people reacted to that, because we were probably the only ones who cared not only about them, but also about their pets.
Well, Yuri, thank you so much for talking to us again. It's really good to see you. And is there anything we haven't spoken about that you'd want to mention?
Well, thank you, David, for having us over. I think that our message to the audience out there is that, unfortunately, as the war continues to go on, we are in it for the long run. And while the shelters in Ukraine, about 70% of their needs were coming from private donations, because of the large exodus of people from Ukraine, because so many people left, this donor base for these shelters has eroded, and they depend more and more on initiatives like ours to meet their needs, to keep doing the good work that they are doing. So our message there is that we also, for the long run, would continue to look for donations, either in pet food, either in animal supplies, or in financial donations, to make sure that we can keep supporting these shelters throughout the next year. And we hope very much that the war will be over soon, but it looks like our job is there for us still for a long time.
Well, Yuri, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for speaking to us again. Anzelika, would you like to add anything or come in on anything before we finish?
I'm really appreciate that you interested to us and to the situation in Ukraine and to the pets. So I think it was a great experience for us, and hope it's not the end. And if we can just give to your audience some information or some stories, we glad with it. So just say us, and we also agreed with it.
Well, thank you very much, Yuri. Thank you, Anzelika. Thank you, Anzelika, especially for putting us back in touch. It was very interesting to hear all of that. Thank you very much. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Giles Gear and Isabel Bouchard, and today on Twitter, Robbie Nichols.